hope that you can hear me well. My name is McKay Cunningham. I am one of the co-chairmen of the City Club Forums Committee. I'm also a professor at the College of Idaho, and I will be the moderator for today's forum, Immigration Impacts in Idaho. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We begin by acknowledging the ancestral, cultural, and traditional unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute people on which we are meeting today. City Club of Boise is a nonpartisan and nonprofit that brings people together for community conversations around local, state, and national issues that matter because things happen when people start talking and listening. Thanks to all of our current members and individual donors. By the way, if you are not a donor or a member rather of City Club, please join us. Your City Club membership makes our community stronger. There's a QR code, like this one right here, on your tables, and there's a 50% discount if you join as a member within the next 24 hours. I'd like to take this time real quick to recognize our sponsors, of which there are many. If you could please hold your applause until the end. Our annual sponsors are the University of Idaho, Boise State University School of Public Service, the City of Boise, and the Idaho Humanities Council. Our 2025 Forum Series sponsors are AARP, Albertsons, Holy Troxel, Idaho Education Association, Micron, Select Health, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke's. City Club receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council and the Idaho Community Foundation. Our community partner is the Osher Institute for Lifelong Learning at Boise State University. Boise State Public Radio is our principal media sponsor. Idaho Public Television is also a media sponsor. Thank you to friends of City Club who give $2,500 or more to sustain our work. Thank you to AJ and Susie Belukov, the Fry family, George and Bev Herod, Skip and Esther Oppenheimer, Darwin and Char Roy, Peg Doitery, Sydney and Clark Fiddler. Idaho Farm Bureau is sponsoring today's forum, and finally, thank you to the organizations sponsoring tables today. Today's City Club Forum addresses a topic that has been in state and national news. It is a topic that has been divisive in many circles that we find ourselves in. And frankly, guys, I think today, at the end of our time, a lot of us, myself included, will be frustrated by the topics that we don't cover, the topics that we cover just a little bit but do not get into too deeply. So to that end, please continue this conversation with people around you. It's a value-based discussion that needs to continue to go on. Secondly, in the interest of efficiency, I'll not read off the long resumes of our panelists here. I'll instead just introduce them using their current titles, and I will dispense with honorifics. So let me just introduce them briefly. To my immediate left is Brandy Perez, immigration attorney at Perez Law, founding director of Familias Unidas. In the middle is Rick Marabout, CEO of Idaho Dairymen's Association. And then on the far end, Alicia Moss, immigration attorney at Holy Troxel. Please welcome our panelists. Just so we can know you a little bit better, I'd like for each of you to tell us a little bit about your personal experience, expertise, particularly as it relates to the field of immigration. Brandy, let's start with you.
All right, so like McKay said, I'm Brandy Perez, and immigration is the only thing I ever wanted to do when I decided to go to law school. I am a mid-career law school student, so I didn't start law school until I was in my 30s. And I only wanted to do immigration because I felt like our community needed people, more immigration attorneys who understood the experience. I come from a family of immigrants. My grandfather came here from Cuba, my grandmother from Mexico, and my husband is a Mexican citizen. So immigration is personal to me, and that's how I treat my clients.
So Rick Narrabot, executive with Idaho Dairymen's Association. Immigration for us really comes down to our workforce. So we know that 90% of the dairy workers on the farm level here in the state of Idaho are foreign born, and we don't have access to a visa program. So it doesn't take a degree in math to try and figure out the rough math on that situation as to our dependency on an unauthorized workforce. So for us, that really is a driving factor in the advocacy that we do on this issue, and often end up the face of a lot of conversations because of our willingness to speak out on it when you're looking at things happening in the Capitol building and in DC. And so that's what brought us here to this table today, I guess.
I'm Alicia Moss, I'm a partner at Holly Troxel, immigration attorney. We're building out, hopefully, a very big immigration practice at Holly Troxel so we can serve Idaho, the complete state of Idaho. This area needs a lot of help, as we can tell from issues with our workforce. I came to immigration through my colleague, actually, who's sitting here, Nicole Durden, who initially I wanted to do international human rights law, and I went to law school with her. She had an immigration firm here in Boise, and she said, it's just like human rights law. Come work for me. And I did, and I loved it. And I've been doing immigration exclusively since 2012, graduated from U of I in 2005. And it's really important to me because I think this community, whether it's employers who are trying to bring over employees and foreign workers, or a person who's seeking asylum, or someone who just needs to have their spouse stay with them and not be separated for many years, it brings so much satisfaction to me, and that brings that passion to us, and it brings that passion for my whole team, and we're just happy to be able to serve Idaho. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start with mass deportations. While campaigning, President Trump repeatedly identified mass deportations as a priority, stating, on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. Rick, as CEO of Idaho Dairymen's Association, you've already talked about it a little bit, that 90% of the dairy workers are immigrant workers, but give us a little more of a sense of how many agricultural workers are immigrant workers and what the effect of mass deportation might be, a little more specifically with regard to those industries.
Yeah, so pulling back further than just the dairy industry, looking at agricultural workers as a whole. So every year, Department of Labor goes out and does an ag worker survey. And you've got a federal employee sitting across from an ag worker, and one of the questions they ask is, what's your immigration status? Year in, year out, typically 40% of the respondents admit that they're in country without status. One, that's a brave soul, because I'm not sure I'd be that honest with them. And two, it's a very underreported stat. So as you look at agricultural workers across the country, across all sectors of food production, reasonable estimates put it at 50% of all the on-farm workers are here without status in this country. And you're all enjoying a meal as we talk here today. If we don't have 50% of our workforce, we can't feed ourselves. You can't enjoy your food that you purchase day in, day out at the lowest cost of anywhere in the world. You know, the U.S. farmer does a fantastic job of making sure that we feed our country plus a number of other countries. And we can't do that without this workforce. And it's not for a lack of trying to fix that problem. So I think a lot of people perceive ag as just being content with the situation. Ag has been one of the most vocal voices out there to say, hey, we need to fix this problem. And we've been saying that for almost 20 years now. Hey, we need to fix this problem. We've got exposure. We've got a dependence on this workforce that we can't live without. We need to figure out how to give them legal status and make sure everybody has access to visa programs to be able to fill the jobs that we need just to do the basic things like feed ourselves as a country.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up. Yesterday, I believe, on Idaho Matters, Rick, you were asked a question about pricing. And I wonder if you remember your response. The question was, if, let's just say 50% of the migrant farm workers in the dairy industry were no longer there, were deported. Currently, a gallon of milk costs around $4.80. What would it cost if half of the migrant population within the dairy industry in Idaho were no longer working?
You know, truly, I don't think it's going to be a matter of cost. It's going to be a matter of, is the milk supply going to be there? And what McKay's trying to back in, the script I used yesterday on the Idaho Matters piece. So with the dairy cow, you know, she's got to be milked multiple times a day. You can't just decide, not today, I don't feel like milking cows. They've got to be milked 2 to 3 times a day. And so if we take away our workforce and you end up with dairies sitting there with cattle that aren't fed or milked, you essentially destroy them as a productive dairy animal. You know, she has to continue to lactate. She has to continue to be able to produce milk on that lactation curve where, you know, it's going to be at a rate of lactation that she can pay her feed bill and all the other bills related to the dairy. And it's a dangerous analogy, and I've been married 25 years, or I'll be married 25 years this year, so I feel like I'm a little bit safe here. But a cow, it's like a lactating mother. If you're nursing, my wife nursed, if you're nursing and you have something disrupt that, you no longer are able to produce milk at the same rate, and you probably often have to supplement with other means. And so a cow's no different. You know, we have to continue to get her to lactate. We have to continue to milk her and feed her and care for her every day. And so with the dairy industry, that's why I say it's not a matter of what you're willing to pay. It's the reality that there's probably not going to be available dairy products because you would damage so much of our national herd in this situation if you took away the labor, because we can only go a couple days before that cow is no longer a productive dairy cow.
Thank you. Let's turn to our esteemed lawyers. We've been talking about mass deportations, but we haven't seen them, have we? At least not here in Idaho. And I guess one of my questions is that because of the legal difficulty in actually effectuating mass deportations? What is the legal process for a typical normative deportation procedure?
So I think there's 2 points to that. One is that there are some level of mass deportation, but they're targeted at what we call sanctuary states. So our neighbors, Oregon and Washington, are seeing this enforcement, and it's definitely heightened enforcement where maybe they'll target one person, but they'll take all the people around them, the collaterals. And then they're looking at businesses as well. Extra I-9 audits and things like that. So that we are seeing in other states. In Illinois, I think that's one that maybe everybody's familiar with. It would happen in Chicago. In Idaho, we're not really seeing the significant uptick that we're seeing in other states. And I do believe it's because of manpower, but it is also because we are not considered a sanctuary state. And as long as we're not considered that, I think initially we're not going to see a lot of that in Idaho. We'll see more targeted to criminals, people with previous deportation orders and things like that. So then to go to your question about how it usually works, we could use the target as an example. So say they have an actual individual that they're targeting. Maybe they are in court for a criminal charge, and it may not be even a conviction, just a charge. They'll target that person, they'll go look for them. If they're in court, they'll have an idea of when they're court hearing this, and they may go look for them at court. Or if they know where they work, they may find them at work or follow them from work. They're going to have what's called an administrative warrant from the Department of Homeland Security. That administrative warrant is not signed by the judge, but it does allow them to take a person who has certain immigration violations into custody in a public place. Because if I want to juxtapose administrative warrants from judicial warrants, they cannot go into private businesses and private places unless they have a judicial warrant signed by a judge. And it's really important to remember that because a lot of people will just consent to people coming into their businesses, consent into them coming into their homes, and then they'll detain them. So then the next question is whether they're subject to mandatory detention, or they can be released on an administrative bond or a court bond. And so depending on that, they'll be either released or they'll be continued to be detained. If they are detained, their court case will go a different way than if they're not detained, because that's the next step, is they put them into immigration removal or deportation proceedings. If they're detained, they'll be in the detention center, and there'll be immigration judges and staff at the detention center for them, and those cases are a little more expedited, where you're seeing the final hearing, basically the administrative trial, within 4, 6, 8 months. If they're not in court. I mean, if they're not detained and they're still in court, you may not see your final hearing until 2 to 4 years from the time you go in. I've even had clients wait 6, 7, 8 years for their final hearing. And so you have this situation where they're in limbo and they don't know what's going to happen. They don't understand their case could get worse, it could get better, it could get stale. What makes their case strong now would be very different in 8 years. The other thing with people who are mandatorily detained is their case could go more than that 4 to 8 months. There are people who've been detained for 2 years, 3 years as they fight their case. And even sometimes habeas petitions won't get them out of that detention. But that's generally how the targeted enforcement, detention, and then into immigration court works.
Yeah, thank you. And it's noteworthy to me as you are describing that process that there actually is an immigration panel, a judge, there is a trial, there's an opportunity for the defendant to say, no, I was actually here legally and this is why. I say that to set up the next question, which is an executive order, one of 12 or 13 that were issued by the president within the first couple of weeks of taking office. The one I'm referring to is titled Protecting the American People Against Invasion. And I think that word is very important. Invasion, it's purposeful. It is akin to a national emergency that thereby wants, according to this executive order, the use of the military, the use of armed forces, and dealing with this threat to our national security. So this executive order also includes expedited removal. And I'd like for our lawyers to talk about what expedited removal looks like as opposed to the process that we just heard you lay out for a more typical deportation.
Okay, I just want to make sure Brandy gets in there too. But I'm happy to talk about it. We both do all of these things, and she has a very large depth of knowledge as well. So normally, expedited removal in the recent past has been for people who come to the border, they don't have a visa, they're trying to get in, they don't have documentation, or maybe they have a misrepresentation in their past or a previous deportation, or they've crossed over illegally usually, and then they're within 14 days they get found inside the United States. That's how generally it's been. We have laws that allow for the expeditious removal without seeing an immigration judge. Recently with the new executive orders, they've changed the criteria, and so now instead of being more focused at the border and people within that 14 days of entry, now they can expeditiously remove people who have been here 2 years or less, and anywhere in the United States, not just at border areas within 100 miles of the border. And what that does, though, like I said, you don't get to see an immigration judge, you don't get to fight a case, say you have family members or you have other significant ties to the U.S. that you could use to fight a case. You don't get that. However, you will get what's called a credible fear interview. And if you have fear of going back to your home country, and if you can pass that federal credible fear interview, you would be able to stay. But you're subject to mandatory detention. So as you try to fight for your case, and because of your fear of going back to your home country, you will be mandatorily detained through that whole process. And that's there's a little more to expedited removal as well, but that's generally what has recently changed in the most recent executive order.
One more just quick follow-up, and I'm sorry, Greg, if you want to dive in there, go ahead, please.
Oh. I just wanted to say that detention isn't necessarily local. So right now, they're primarily taking people to Las Vegas. So if you have all your family and your support system here in Idaho, you're not going to have access to them. It's going to be very hard for them to visit you and to provide you the support that you need. And then if your attorney's here, then there's a matter of like paying extra expenses for them to go there or try to communicate with you there. So it really limits what somebody can do if they do want to try to fight the expedited removal.
Is this executive order legal? I mean, especially if it allows for expedited removal without the traditional due process protections, especially if we're talking about things like indefinite detention. And there has been an argument made by the president that, quote, we have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people. Is this a legal executive order?
I'm glad I'm not an attorney.
It depends.
Well, as you know, McKay, that's subject to a lot of interpretation, but I think what's trying to be done, and the reason why they specifically use the word invasion, is to set it up to say that this is part of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 that does give them the authority to, detain people if the United States is being invaded by a country as designated by the president. So, in my personal opinion, I don't think it's legal, but I'm not a judge, and that's what's going to be determined eventually.
I think you're right. I think the judicial branch is what's going to put some guardrails around what's going on in the executive branch. But besides that act, they also have Immigration Nationality Act 212F. And I have a quote here because I wanted everybody to hear it, because it is, I think the answer is it depends. I know it's a lawyer answer, but it will be fought in the courts. But this other provision says whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the U.S. would be detrimental to the interests of the U.S., he may, by proclamation and for such period as he shall deem necessary, so that's indefinite to me, suspend the entry of all aliens, all, or any class of aliens. For example, H-2A workers could say, hey, that's not in the interest of the United States. All H-2As, no, sorry. As immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of any aliens, any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate. That is passed by Congress. Right? So that's what we're really looking at, to give the incredibly broad powers over these executive orders. And that's what we're going to be fighting in the court, is where is the scope of this? What is constitutionally correct under this? And can there be any arguments made for INA 212F that any parts of it's unconstitutional or there's any issues with it? And again, it's a law made by Congress. So who can change it? Congress. Senators Crapo, Risch, Representative Simpson, and Fulcher. And just as a note, our organization, the Immigration Lawyers Association organization, we go out and lobby. I've been out about 5 times, and we lobby for Idaho workers and employers. We don't just, it's not everybody. We know that the workforce is suffering. We can have H2Ds for dairies. We can have H2Cs for construction. We can have a better system.
Yeah, there's been some questions about what that better system might look like, and we're going to get to that for sure. But I think that it was really nice hearing from our lawyers about the the vast amount of discretion that the federal government is given by the courts with regard to immigration decisions. And we don't have to go back too far in time to think about the Korematsu case that allowed for the Japanese internment camps here in Idaho. That was an executive order, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that's okay to round up without any process, without any due process, folks, including U.S. citizens that had Japanese heritage for those concentrations. Let's switch gears. A lot of proponents with regard to a lot of these immigration changes cite a number of justifications. Let's talk about those. One is that we need these jobs for U.S. citizens, and immigrant workers are taking U.S. jobs. Another is that immigrants come to this country and are violent criminals. A third is that immigrant populations are a drain on the national economy. So let's take those in turn. Rick, I want to start with the first one for you. What about jobs and immigrant workforce? Are they taking jobs that otherwise would be taken by U.S. citizens?
So, speaking from an agricultural perspective, you make that comment to a farmer and they laugh at you. The reality is, ag jobs have not been filled by a domestic workforce outside of family workers for decades. And probably one of the best examples we have is working with an H-2A contractor, and in discussions with them, they cover multiple western states, but last growing season, they had over 6,000 H-2A positions that they were advertising for. Because with the H-2A program, you have to advertise to try and find a domestic worker before you can hire an immigrant worker. So they were advertising over 6,000 H-2A jobs in the western U.S. They got about 35 applicants for 6,000 jobs. Of the 35 applicants, they were able to get 12 interviews. Of the 12 interviews, 2 hires. Of the 2 hires, neither made it to harvest. That's the reality of who's seeking out these agricultural jobs. And more often than not, people don't realize that it's a fairly simple math equation. You look at our birth rate and you look at the number of workers exiting the workforce versus those that are entering and the growth of our economy, and there is just a sheer shortage of domestic workers to fill the jobs we have available in our U.S. economy if we want to maintain our U.S. economy. And it's not a complicated math equation to figure that out, but that seems to be lost on a significant portion of the population, in that we can't have the robust economy that we have in America if we don't bring workers into our country to fill a certain portion of these jobs. And where we failed from ag or construction or service or hospitality and all these other sectors that their workforce looks just like the dairy workforce, is we have failed to have visas line up and have there be enough visas available for the demand of workers in those fields that the domestic workforce does not want to fill. And so we make it way more complicated than it needs to be, but really it comes down to basic math.
Thank you. What about with the issue of crime? Does the data match the rhetoric? Bloodthirsty criminals, hardened criminals, are you more likely to be in trouble with the penal system as a non-citizen or a citizen?
In my experience working with the immigrant community, I find that immigrants tend to be victims more than the perpetrators of crime. They're a set of the community that doesn't have necessarily all the protections that we expect as U.S. citizens or people with other legal status. And so that's actually one of the focuses of my firm, is I try to help these victims of crimes find benefits so that they can continue to help us keep our community safer. That's why we have this thing called a U visa. It's specifically for victims of crime, because we know that if you report the crime, then there's less criminals on the street. And we also have a thing called a T visa for victims of trafficking. There's a significant number of people who are trafficked every day, including here in Idaho, in Nampa, in Boise. And that's why our Congress at some point in time also agreed with that and created those laws and created those pathways. So in my experience, no, immigrants are less likely to be the criminal. I'm not saying that they're never the criminal. There's bad in any community, but they're less likely to be.
Thank you. We've been talking about immigrant workers almost like they are fungible goods. That's my fault. My questions have been along, how does it affect our agriculture? How does it affect our milk industry? Is it like taking jobs away from U.S. citizens? I think it's really important that we talk about the humane treatment of human beings as well within this discussion. So can I ask what your experiences have been on a more human, on a more relationship level, or undocumented people in Idaho scared? How, if at all, are they being supported?
I definitely think there's a lot of fear, and I think that was intentional. I think because we don't have the manpower to remove the people that the administration wants to remove, it's more about the self-deportation. And what the fear, though, is doing is it's keeping people from sending their kids to school, seeking medical care, going to work, traveling for necessary reasons, not going to church. We in Idaho love our families, and I think our families make Idaho one of the best states around, and our communities and the family kind of going out from those communities and making our community strong. These types of things are just making the families break more. And when you then add the mandatory detention and the new rules for mandatory detention, where, for example, the Lake and Riley Act allowed for a simple petty theft charge, not conviction, for maybe stealing $10 worth of groceries, 501 banana, mandatory detention, just the charge. So when you look at those types of things, it seems very anti-family to me, and it also is just a promotion of fear, and it is absolutely happening. My clients are very afraid. And besides even that part of it, because I think our businesses, we still have to consider that, because those people are working for the businesses, and we have to really look at how that affects the whole community. Because when you treat someone inhumanely, then and they don't go to work, and then the business suffers, and then our communities suffer. It's just a kind of a spider web that goes out from that one thing.
Can you talk just very briefly about what supportive organizations are out there for our non-citizen immigrants?
Not very many. I think, Brandy, you want to talk about? Yeah.
There are several organizations. So there's the Idaho Hispanic Foundation that's trying to present information. There's organizations like Community Council of Idaho that provides support and resources throughout the state to migrant seasonal farm workers and their families. But no, resources, like especially legal resources, those are almost non-existent in Idaho. There's no real funding for immigration legal services. So I came out of law school and I founded a nonprofit through Community Council of Idaho to provide those immigration legal resources. And I worked there for 4 years and didn't receive one dime in grant money. I did receive a lot of support from Rick's organization. Thank you, Rick. They're the only reason why we were able to keep our doors open. But eventually we found some workarounds where you focus on working on victims of crime, and there was funding for that, but not specific to immigration. And even the few resources that are available for unaccompanied minors and children who also don't have a right to paid representation in our immigration court system, some of those resources are being cut off. They were cut off and then recently reinstated, but they could be cut off again. So there's not as much support in our community as we have immigrants. So we definitely need more people thinking about that and trying to find ways to help organizations like Community Council of Idaho or the Hispanic Foundation, provide the resources that are necessary.
Thank you. Alicia, you mentioned something that I think bears a little bit of more emphasis, and that is a long-standing law or rule that disallowed ICE raids with regard to certain areas, schools, churches, and hospitals. And this ties into the discussion that we have been having with regard to what is the immigrant population doing, especially now with that being in the news. Are they going to church less frequently? Are they foregoing necessary medical care because of rhetoric like, the law as it is now?
I'm definitely seeing that. We also have a small satellite office in Teton Valley, Idaho, and I just use that as an example because I've been doing some presentations to nonprofit organizations, and then the mayor just had a meeting with the sheriff and some of the law enforcement and the community members there and nonprofits. And the reason why the mayor did that is because they saw the enrollment in Teton Valley School just drastically dip as soon as this came out. And they saw the hospitals also notice the dip in people going for care. So I'm actually seeing that on the ground and in these smaller communities in Idaho in a very significant way. I mean, Boise's different, right? And the Treasure Valley has a little bit larger population. We have more resources. Maybe we can get the word out better. But in the small communities, rural communities in Idaho, I think that's where we're seeing this the most. And it's really negatively affecting these communities where the leaders are trying to step up and work with law enforcement. And for example, in Teton Valley, the sheriff came out and said, we are not going into churches. We are not going into schools. We are cooperating with ICE, of course, and ICE will contact us. They are not going to go in. We are building these relationships to do that. There's a few other sheriffs who put out letters as well in southern Idaho, and I think it's great that they're doing that, but it's super unfortunate that we have to have all these pain points and disruption in families' lives and our communities' lives to get there.
I'd like to remind our radio listeners that you are listening to the City Club of Boise Forum, Immigration Impacts in Idaho. I've had a lot of questions from the audience with regard to other policy possibilities. I mean, I think there's a lot of consensus maybe across the United States with regard to the desire to have a uniform and clear policy with regard to immigration at the border. Can you talk about other possible policies that might be effective and might be a little more of the middle of the road?
I think the targeted enforcement priorities, those work really well. Even in law enforcement, non-immigration, your general law enforcement, sheriff, police, prosecutors, they all have prosecutorial discretion. We can't arrest everyone who breaks a law. We all know that. We have this contract with our society that says, here's this law, you shouldn't break it. However, somebody's going to decide whether they enforce that law against you on many, many factors. Some of them are about mitigating factors, some are about resources, many reasons. And so when we come back to immigration, we have the same type of prosecutorial discretion, even though it's civil, because everything about immigration, except for very few federal crimes, are all civil violations. And it's not illegal to be here illegally. That's kind of how I jokingly refer to it. It's not illegal to be here illegally. It is illegal to enter. That is a federal crime, and we have that. So when we look at a middle of the road, it's going to be those priorities. Let's go after bad criminals. Who wants people who are raping people here or murdering people? Nobody wants that. I have not met one immigration lawyer who wants open borders. I've never met anyone who wants open borders. We need enforcement at the border. We need a regulatory system that works. The reason why we can't get to the middle ground is because we don't have a robust non-immigrant worker visa system. And I'm sorry I keep coming back to that, and I don't mean to commoditize anyone, but the problem becomes is we just have people, we have kind of two groups of people coming, they're afraid for their lives, and they're coming over to be safe. And then they just cannot have a livelihood and sustain themselves in their own countries and their families, and they're suffering greatly. And we have opportunities here because we need an immigrant workforce. So of course they're attracted to come here and find jobs here. And all we need is something that makes sense, because right now, almost every non-immigrant worker, temporary worker program that's unskilled is by lottery, except for the H-2A program. There's no year-round, except for very specific exceptions to those programs. And we can do better. We can also have state-specific programs. And so when we have that, then we can get to the middle ground, because the middle ground's going to get all the people we want out of this country without scaring everybody to try to self-deport and keep our workforce and keep our businesses running and keep our milk.
The policy discussions have to be two-part. It can't just be enforcement. And that's where we're at right now, is everything is focused on the enforcement aspect of it. You know, again, like you said, nobody disagrees that we need to secure our border and have good border policy. Everybody agrees with that. But that can't be the only focus. We have to figure out, how do we create more legal pathways to be able to support individuals that want to come into our country. And support individuals, they want to pursue, quite often, the American dream that we all have the opportunity to pursue. And we have to figure out how to have that also be part of the conversation, because we're not going to survive economically if it's just an enforcement type conversation. And it's got to happen at a federal level. At a state level, the state can get themselves involved on the enforcement side, but they can't do anything to solve the visa side of this. They can't do anything to offer legal status. And really, when we're advocating for this issue in DC, that's really our top 2 points, is, you know, provide a mechanism to legalize the existing workforce that's here. You know, don't make it complicated, have them pay a fine. You know, that's how we solve misdemeanors in our legal system, and it's a misdemeanor that they've committed. So pay a monetary penalty for the misdemeanor, have them pass a background check, and let them stay in the job that they've been trained in and fill that job in the economy. And then give us access to a visa program. Those are the 2 things that we are trying to accomplish and have been trying to accomplish for 20 years now. And you wouldn't think it'd be as difficult as it is, but it feels like every time we get close, other politics get in the way, and it ends up slipping out of our control.
Yeah, this question right here is why? Why hasn't it happened if we've been lobbying for it for such a long time and it makes sense?
So go back to, I want to say it was 2013, 2014. We had a bill that passed the Senate, comprehensive immigration reform. I want to say it was Senate Bill 744, passed the Senate. The House recessed for midterm elections, midterm primaries. There were the votes in the House to pass it. Boehner was the speaker at the time. Eric Cantor was in House leadership, and he went home and lost his primary. Eric Cantor was an advocate for this comprehensive immigration bill, and it was cited as one of the reasons he lost his primary election. Somebody ran to the right of him and beat him on this issue. And that scared Republicans away from taking that bill up in the House that year. It was a comprehensive bill. The votes were there to pass it. Bipartisan votes were there to pass it. Republicans were scared to take it up because they didn't want to lose more members of their caucus in elections. And so it's always been situations like that where you end up with us getting really, really close, but then we can't get it to the finish line. Two of the last three Congresses, and Congressman Mike Simpson's been instrumental in pushing for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Not this last Congress, the previous two, it passed out of the House with bipartisan votes. We couldn't find 60 votes in the Senate. We were close. We were within a few votes of getting 60 in the Senate, but you got to get 60 in the Senate to be able to get something through the Senate. And so we've been close, and again, that was not comprehensive, that was just ag. But as we were trying to negotiate that bill, the reality was every other economic sector and all the unions looked at it and said, well, whatever the provisions of that bill are going to be, that's going to be the template for the rest of the economic sectors to try and get a visa for their economic sector. And so you still had the influence of others coming into those negotiations and affecting how, we had Senator Crapo from Idaho as a Republican negotiator, you had Senator Bennett from Colorado. They had, those other interests in their ears as well when they were trying to find middle ground. They never were able to find middle ground in those 60 votes to get it passed.
In addition to employment visas, because I don't actually focus on that in my own practice, I focus on family and humanitarian based. We need to do something about the visa caps for family-based cases. It should not take 25 years to bring a family member to the United States. And that's how long it can take. It should not take a US citizen 3 years to bring their spouse from another country. 3 years. Could you imagine marrying somebody and not being able to see them on a regular basis or raise your family together because it takes that long, because our processing times are completely backlogged, but our visas are not available. There's just not enough visas. We have the need, we have people that want to bring people here, but we can't because of the way that the system is. So in addition to employment, we have to focus on the family. We're a nation that prioritizes family, but when you look at our immigration system, you wouldn't believe that.
Thank you. My understanding, looking at a lot of these executive orders that have come out in the last 30 days, is that there will be a tightening up of the visa process going forward. Do you guys see that as being likely to occur and the problem that Brandy just identified worsening because of these executive orders?
I definitely do see that coming. It hasn't happened yet. I think it's going to probably be a little bit lopsided as well. I think there's going to be more restrictions on maybe family members who are the siblings, maybe parents, right? They're still going to, fiancés and spouses likely are going to be relatively okay. But what will be lopsided as well is because I think there are people in the administration who want certain worker visas that will be less effective. And those are going to be those specialty occupation ones that require a college degree. So I think there could be some detrimental impact on the unskilled H-2B program already. That's that one that's by lottery. I think then we haven't talked about it yet, but there's the employment-based green cards where employers will sponsor people for green cards. Certain countries have very large backlogs, similar to what Brandy was talking about in the family arena, where, for example, an Indian national citizen will wait 15 to 17 years for their green card. So clergy plan for that. I think, and the Chinese the same way. So I think we're also going to see some focus on where maybe those become worse or certain ones become better or certain countries are prioritized. For example, we've heard some talk about prioritizing people from South Africa over others. And if you're going to have a limited amount of visas, because the visa numbers for the categories Brandy's talking about and the categories I'm talking about are set by Congress. So only again, Congress can change these. So then if we have a priority for, say, South Africans, and we don't have an expansion of the visa numbers, they gotta come from somewhere. They gotta be taken from some category. And so I think it's gonna be hard to tell exactly how it will look, but I think it will be a little lopsided and it could very much negatively affect other non-immigrant temporary worker visas, plus the family reunification types where we have fewer for outside spouses and fiancés.
There are a few questions from the audience about the asylum and refugee programs. We have a fairly robust refugee community, particularly here in the Treasure Valley. I wonder if our lawyers can speak to how those programs are affected in light of recent executive orders.
Well, one of the executive orders puts a stop on anybody coming as a refugee while they figure out what they want to do with it. So then we have organizations like the International Rescue Committee and the Agency for New Americans that were set up because they received federal funding to help bring refugees over, which, by the way, refugees are vetted, and vetted again before they're even allowed to come. It is a years-long process. They don't just get to apply and then boom, the next day they're here. They are checked thoroughly before we finally say, okay, we'll allow this small number of people to come. But now that's stopped. Just like people, so refugee and asylee, it's basically the same thing in the law, except a refugee is applying outside of the country and an asylee is applying in the country. Well, we're not allowing anybody coming here to claim asylum either. They're stopped at the border. They can't come here. Our country has these asylum laws because we saw such horrible things happening after World War II. We have international agreement that allows for people to come here when they're being persecuted in their country of origin. We can now be asylees in Canada. But for right now, I mean, the refugee communities, I heard on the news about people who were on their way here and they had to say, no, sorry, we have to stay outside the country. Families that are separated, where half of the family's already here, but the other half was making their way here, but now we don't know when they're going to be able to join their families. So again, we have a country that values family, except when it comes to immigrant families.
So this executive order that blocks or suspends the refugee program and it blocks seekers of asylum, that arguably violates a statute, the Immigration and National Acts provisions that purposefully allow for those programs. Do you foresee a litigation challenge in the near future?
I definitely do, but I want to come back to that Immigration Nationality Act 212F that I mentioned and quoted part of that statutory provision. That's what this is being done under. This is incredibly broad powers. And then the federal government has broad powers over immigration under the Constitution, or the interpretation of the Constitution. Very, very broad powers to do a lot when the person is outside of the country. Once the person is physically here, they have more rights. So we're going to have maybe two categories of litigation when it comes to these types of things. And I definitely think it will be, but will INA 212F win out? I think it's very possible that the Supreme Court could say, yes, it does win.
What are the most common questions that you're fielding from your clients? And maybe, Rick, you can respond to that by what are some of the questions that you are fielding from Idaho immigrant workers?
Well, for workers, for employers, I'll start with that. A lot of my questions are, am I going to be able to bring over foreign workers at all? Is it going to happen? We're in the middle of what's called H-2B season right now, which is that unskilled temporary worker permit for all non-ag, and that's by lottery, and we have, they give you 33,000 per lottery season, which there's only 2, and there's a supplemental for 20, and then there's a tiny little 5,000 that sometimes I can get people in by June, right? You don't have many months left. But that's what I'm really feeling from my employers, and then the employees who work for the companies who then want to stay permanently and get green cards. That process can be anywhere from 3 to 6 years for that employer to sponsor them, so they're very concerned about that. We do humanitarian-based and asylum-based and family-based as well, and I think it's the fear of what's going to happen and the fear of the unknown. That's the biggest thing for us, those questions of that.
Yeah, from the employer side, really the biggest question is, okay, is this going to be like the first administration where the focus was on those involved in criminal activity and the workforce was largely, left alone, or is it going to trickle down to our workforce at some point during this administration? And so that's really the biggest question we're getting from employers is, how is this going to play out this time? And great question.
It is a great.
Both Brandy and Alicia have mentioned ICE raids, and the legality behind it. I would imagine a lot of our listening audience and folks in the room here are associated with organizations that may have international workers within them. What are the rights that folks have, maybe an employer, with regard to how and when they must comply with an ICE official asking for information about workers?
So
I think it depends on if you're in a raid posture or an I-9 audit posture. So I'll start with the I-9 audit posture. I think that's what we're going to see here in Idaho more than raids, again, because we're not considered a sanctuary state. But the ICE audit starts with a notice of inspection. So you get a letter, and by law you have 3 days to turn over your original I-9s to the investigating officer. It is an administrative process, but when you employ people, you are agreeing to these laws. I usually can get extensions for employers, so what I tell my employers, just contact me as soon as you get the notice of investigation. I'll contact the HSI, Homeland Security Investigation Special Agent for you, and we'll get a little bit of extension. If I don't work with you already, I would look at your I-9s. I do like a little bit of an internal audit really quickly to see where we're at. Then, once you have that notice of investigation, you usually will take it down to Boise ICE, if that's what we're just assuming we're here, and you'll bring those original I-9s, and then you'll have a separate document, which is a subpoena. And the subpoena will have a list of other supporting documents that you can email to the HSI special agent, and I help the employers gather those. Sometimes they'll ask for more things than relevant, that are necessary, so we'll kind of decide what we're going to give them and working with the officers, but the agents, I try to work really well with them because we're all just trying to do our jobs, right? I'm trying to protect the employer or make sure that they're compliant with the law, make sure we're helping them, but the agents are also doing their jobs, and so we work within the law on those things. Then the next step is a notice of fine usually, and then we mitigate and try to negotiate those fines. There is criminal liability for I-9 issues if you know, or basically should have known, that the person was undocumented. You can be criminally charged. Who they criminally charge will really depend on the structure of the company, so I won't get into that too much. So then we'll negotiate those fines, we'll negotiate the criminal issues if there are any criminal issues, and then we see where that ends up. If you're having multiple violations, those fines will just continue to go up. They can be anywhere from like $300 per violation to $3,000 per violation. So you can see if your workforce is large, you could look at tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of fines, but if you have a small workforce, it's usually not going to be terrible. But the raids are very different. Raids are done with judicial warrants, judicial subpoenas, all of it is a judicial process, and you do not have much to say when you come with judicial warrants and subpoenas, except for arguing the scope of those. So it'll describe where they want to go look, who they want to come get, and things like that in the raid. And so you have to read that really carefully, call your lawyer as soon as possible, and then you have to let them go where the subpoena or the warrant tells you you to let them go. Whereas the administrative process, you do not have to let them in private areas. And so they have the right to come in the public area of your space and ask, deliver the notice of investigation, ask for those I-9s, but you can keep them out of private spaces. But again, the judicial warrant is for the raids are very serious, and you really do need to engage a lawyer as soon as possible if there's a raid.
We keep talking about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I would say our dairymen, they experience something typically somewhere between both those two situations, historically, in that they'll have ICE reach out and say, hey, we're looking for this, this individual, we think they're employed in your operation. Can you assist in helping us identify this individual? And they're typically people that are involved in criminal activity and somebody you don't want around your family or business. Because most farmers in Idaho, they live on the operation, so you're talking both their family and their business. And we encourage, with legal counsel, to cooperate, help them identify that individual, and set up a time and place to where you can, have ICE come and apprehend them. It doesn't feel great, but the reality is, it's the best way to approach that situation. And we encourage our employers cooperate with legal counsel, have them help you figure out how to navigate this. But that's been over the last 10 years, that's been the most often interaction that we have in these scenarios.
Well, we keep talking about criminals and how ICE is going to prioritize deportation of criminals, and it begs the question, what is a criminal? How do we define that? The executive order that we've been talking about already a little bit, that's titled Protecting the American People Against Invasions. Part of that executive order states the following, that undocumented aliens must register their presence. Failure to comply is to be treated as criminal. So doesn't that now mean that every undocumented person who does not voluntarily register as an undocumented person is now a criminal, such that this idea that ICE is going to prioritize criminals becomes a much bigger pool of people to prioritize?
I think that's what the intent of this is, but we do have to remember that there are some constitutional amendments that give police power to states and separate police power to the federal government. And I have not seen an 8 USC, that's where some of the criminal lies for federal laws about criminalizing this. So in my mind, until I see a law passed from Congress that criminalizes this, I don't see how this executive order could do it. I don't see yet this being pushed. I haven't seen any way to register. I haven't seen anything to do. And again, this seems more akin to something that's either coming or it's more about the fear and of people. But it does say that. It does say that just being here undocumented will be a priority again, rather than just criminals. But I haven't necessarily seen that in Idaho, again, that targeting of just anybody yet.
Yeah, thank you. I will add that on January 21st, the Acting Attorney General issued a memo to the Department of Justice staff prioritizing a number of migration-related offenses for criminal prosecutions, and among them were folks who failed to register as undocumented. One last question before we sign off. You know what, I'll stop there. Let's do this instead. How about one last comment from each of you? What is it that you would like for this audience to take away as like a departing note? We'll come down in the reverse order. Why don't you go first, Alicia?
We need comprehensive immigration reform. How we get that is very difficult, and I think it takes all of us contacting our Congress members and making them feel comfortable with signing on to these bills. Right now we have Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid since the last immigration reform that was comprehensive, which was 1996. I don't know how we can live in the 21st century with the system we have, and just would implore you to reach out to your congresspeople, because that's really, I think, how we can change this.
So, I'll take a little bit different time. I mean, fully agree. We need you contacting, senators and congressmen to push on this issue. My high level approach in view of this administration is they're gonna push until they push a little bit past the line and figure out that they've passed the line, then they're gonna pull back to a degree. And they're looking for that line, if you will. I think as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to maintain decorum and calm. People are looking to us, and they're going to respond based on how we're responding as leaders. And I think there's a responsibility on us to maintain that calm and not to get as excited as you sometimes want to get. Because I do believe that is also part of the strategy, is to get people scared and excited and get that response and see where that leads. So that's my approach to this, is maintain that calm, take a step back, look at a bigger picture, and we've lived through worse times in this country related to immigration. And I think we find our way through. It'll probably be messy, but I think we find our way through this one as well.
What I wanted to talk about was, in reading through all of these executive orders and listening to everything, there's so much language that's dehumanizing. I would like everybody to remember that immigrants are humans too. And you probably interact with undocumented people every day and you don't know it. Some of your favorite restaurant owners might be undocumented. The construction workers that are laying the concrete in your front yard, undocumented. Think about that and remember that when you, regardless of where you fall on how you feel about immigration, that there's still people, and talking about them as aliens or whatever other degrading terms, criminals, invaders, that they want to use, that's not helping the situation. Like Rick and Alicia said, we need comprehensive immigration reform, and we need to stay calm, but we also, more importantly, need to remember that immigrants are humans, immigrants are our neighbors, immigrants are part of our community. They're here whether we want them to be or not, and fighting against it in the way that we are isn't going to help our community.
We hope that you have enjoyed this conversation. We hope to see you at the next City Club Forum on March 6th with the Director of the Department of Health and Welfare, Alex Adams. Please join me in thanking our panelists.